When it comes to Teyvat's earliest history, like the time before the Archon War, there's one question that really haunts me. Just how exactly did Celestia defeat the dragons? Dragons were apparently a highly advanced civilization with super powerful autonomous robotics. And even the stuff they made that wasn't meant for war was still equipped with some crazy strong weaponry. So imagine what their actual war machines would have looked like. And on top of that, the Dragon Kings are each capable of bending the primal forces of nature to their will. That's a crazy amount of power to overcome. And Celestia has some big nails and a couple of shadows? The odds are heavily weighted in favor of the dragons. So what happened here? How did Celestia do it? How did Celestia back the dragons so far into a corner that they had to resort to a backup weapon in the form of forbidden knowledge that nearly destroyed the entire world to defeat them? And it didn't even work. Well, today I would like to unravel this mystery. And to do that, I want to go back to the start of everything, to the moment when Teyvat first appeared in Genshin's universe, so I can better understand the circumstances of how it was created. Because those initial laws of creations are the ones that I think the world actually obeys. And by understanding those laws, we'll be able to understand how such laws could be circumvented or even overturned. And that's how we're gonna get our answers. But of course, I'm writing this introduction after I've already written the rest of the theory, so I'm basically speaking to you from the future where I've already done the investigation and found the answers. And let me tell you, the path I took to get there was a labyrinth of crazy, seemingly unrelated things. I looked into Conria, the Hexen Circle, the Hypostasis, the Death of the Sealies, the Missing Moons, the Primordial Ones, Shades, the Principles of Alchemy, Judaic mysticism, and while my investigation did lead me to a satisfying answer, it also led me to a rather unexpected but fascinating conclusion. And you're gonna have to stick around to the end to discover it for yourself. But before we get to that, you wanna see a magic trick? Alrighty then, watch closely as I transform this super cool gaming phone into a supersized gaming phone. Okay, I'm kidding, it's a tablet. The brand spanking new Red Magic Nova gaming tablet, no less, and oh boy is this thing a delight. The Red Magic Nova gaming tablet is a comfortable 10.9 inches or roughly 27.69 centimeters for you metric users, and it's pretty lightweight, a little over a pound or around 530 grams, which makes longer play sessions a whole lot easier on your wrists, which I really appreciate. Unlike other tablets though, the Red Magic expects you to primarily use it in landscape mode. So your front-facing camera is on the long side of the tablet instead of the short side. And both ends of the tablet also have their own speakers, so you can listen to sound in stereo. And I'm not gonna lie guys, I think this tablet has better sound quality than the standalone speakers I bought for my PC. And the load times for Genshin at least are on par with my PC, if not a little bit faster. That Snapdragon 8 Generation 3 leading version processor is really powerful because I have a gaming PC, a tripped out one, and I feel like this comparison shouldn't be as close as it is. And the graphics are beautiful. Genshin runs on its higher settings here easily, and the result is a crisp and sharp and smooth result, which makes sense. The Red Magic Nova gaming tablet has a high definition display with an impressive 840Hz refresh rate and the ability to be super bright. And I love me some good brightness settings on these devices because I like to play outside when the weather is nice. Unfortunately, it's October and the weather is not nice. It's cold. And speaking of cold, I think this is one of the only tablets I've seen with such a robust cooling system. It's got multiple heat sinks and a pair of super quiet fans you won't even know are there. And this cooling system goes a long way in extending the life of your device and the battery, because a battery's biggest enemy is heat. And guys, I've barely scratched the surface, so if you want to learn more about the Red Magic Nova gaming tablet, or if you'd like to pick one up for yourself, you can check out the link downstairs. Doing so really helps the channel out so we can keep doing what we doing. A massive thank you to Nubia and the Red Magic Nova gaming tablet for sponsoring this video, and don't forget, a Red Magic link isn't all that's in the description box. There's also timestamps, spoiler warnings, citations, attributions, and links to related content. And if there are any post-video notes and corrections I want to add later, you can also find those in the pinned comment. Alright, well I think the best place to start investigating things is at the very beginning. So why don't we kick things off by investigating the beginnings of Teyvat itself? Its genesis. Actually, the beginning is kind of a problematic place to start because we have no information about the beginning. So we kind of have to look at the next best thing. Teyvat's re-beginning, its recreation, its a second genesis. Kind of like a second breakfast, but more impactful. So the story of Teyvat's second genesis is primarily recorded in the book Before Sun and Moon, which talks about how the Primordial One, the leader of Celestia, came to power in the first place. This mysterious figure came from outside of Teyvat and is kind of implied to be a sort of alien invader of sorts, and they waged war against the native dragon species that nearly destroyed the world, stole critical parts of their power, and then remodeled the whole planet for the sake of the soon-to-be-born humankind. So in the book, the Primordial One is lauded as a type of creator god, with the author even going so far as to suggest that their name was Phanes, which is actually a reference to the Orphic god of creation. But the thing is, the Primordial One doesn't actually create anything. They just kind of adjust stuff that was already there, and when they are associated with the actual creation process, it's only ever in the presence of one of their four shadows, who we refer to as the Shade of Life, because they created life. And although there isn't a lot of creation in the typical sense that we'd associate creation with, we can still kinda call them a creator god, if only because they seem to be embodying the Agon model of creation, or rather, creation through combat. This is what we call these types of myths, where a god slayed some primordial monsters, usually depicted as dragons, and something is then created as a result of that slaying. The Primordial One fought and killed some of the dragons, and humans were created after that, but not necessarily as a result of the combat. But even if we do accept this as an act of creation, they still didn't create Teyvat, which is what we were looking for here. And while we don't know for sure who did, we can make an educated guess. See, Before Sun and Moon is a book containing the known Genesis myths of Teyvat, as I've established, and as a Genesis text, it is full of references to the Book of Genesis. There are multiple references to the story of Noah's Ark, for example, like with the parts about the year of the Ark's opening or when doves held branches, and it's also referencing the Orphic Genesis myth, which I'm actually not going to talk about, even though I originally planned to. So the Hebrew Bible, which contains the Book of Genesis, actually contains two different models of creation: the Agon model, creation through combat, and the Logos model, creation through speech. So if the Primordial One represents the Agon model, then the one who created Teyvat before their arrival should have used the Logos model, right? Now, in the Book of Genesis, the one who creates through speech at the beginning of time is the Almighty God, and in Genshin, the one who is known as the Heavenly Father, at least according to Nouvellette, is Nibelung. And Heavenly Father, or Our Father who art in heaven, is what the Abrahamic God is often referred to in Chinese. Ergo, I am going to proceed on the assumption that Nibelung is acting as Teyvat's original god. But this assumption means that Nibelung must have been able to use the Logos model of creation, and much like the Abrahamic God, was capable of literally speaking things into existence. Now, in Judaism, this concept of speaking things into existence gets taken a step further. Since God spoke things into existence using words, and words are made up of sounds and letters, then letters must also contain the power of God. In some texts, like the Sefer Yetzirah, the letters themselves are symbolic manifestations of God's power that came into existence at the beginning of time and cannot be destroyed. So in light of that, the only way that Nibelung can take on the role like that of the Abrahamic God is if we can provide enough evidence that Nibelung is connected to powers relating to letters, words, and symbols, so that we can relate him to the Logos model of creation. And thanks to Natlan and Simulanka, we can do that. So in Simulanka, the witch Alice took on the role as the goddess of creation and embodied the Logos model of creation by quite literally speaking things into existence. The instructions on how to do this that she left behind for Nilu were encapsulated in the phrase abracadabra, which basically means to create what I say. Now I bring up Simulanka here because the big summertime Hexen Circle events are always packed with foreshadowing for the next region, and I think Alice's role was meant to allude to how the dragons created the world, which we were going to learn more about in Natlan. Because so far in Natlan, we've learned that the dragons possessed a special form of linguistic magic that they called the iridescent inscriptions. This golden lettering serves as a sort of command, blueprint, or a set of instructions that dictate how elemental energy should behave, or at least the phlogiston, which is pure pyro-elemental energy, so we're going to count that. And they can do this in one of two ways. Either they dictate the flow or behavior of the target elemental energy, or they can transmute it. For example, the inscriptions are capable of changing the composition of phlogiston from a liquid to a solid, or even into a weird rainbow floaty highway in the sky. And technically speaking, a How is also made out of phlogiston. His real form was sealed within a wristband engraved with iridescent inscriptions, so the little pixelated body that we see is just a phlogiston projection. Yet another example of the powers of dragon tech. Now, I suspect that this magic system is the origins of modern alchemy, which means that modern alchemy is an attempt by humans to mimic the transmutation abilities of dragons, similarly to how the phlogiston carving was meant to mimic the functions of iridescent inscriptions in Natlan specifically. And I say this because according to the Dust of Azoth, alchemy is primarily the study of the nature of matter and the rules that underpin its transformations, and the process of alchemical transmutation requires both a blueprint and a material. And because some energy is lost in the transmutation process, oftentimes more elemental energy must be added. Now, technically speaking, unless you're albedo, you can't perform alchemy just anywhere. You have to use a crafting bench, and you may have noticed that there are letters inscribed on the base, and an incantation is spoken before any transmutation can be done. Earth and water, wind and fire, craft for me what I desire. And actually, there's this merchant from the Nightwind tribe that seems to think the same way I do, commenting that sound can also alter the crafting process, kind of like the incantation I just mentioned. Now again, if you're not albedo, the only other way to transmute things on the go is with the parametric transformer, which doesn't actually give you any control over the final result, likely because it lacks instructions on what to do. But even without a connection to words or blueprints, this device is definitely dragon adjacent because it's ridiculously close in design to some of the dragon devices that we get to see in Natlan. In this way, you can think of elemental energy as the building blocks of the world, and as elemental beings who possess total authority over these elemental building blocks, dragons are effectively the original alchemists. All that said, there is no better means by which this relationship between elements and words can be explicitly seen than by that of the hypostasis. Now in Genshin, a hypostasis is basically a pure block of high-density elemental energy, representing the building block of the material world. But you might notice that they're also named after letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So you remember what I said earlier about how the letters of the blocky Hebrew alphabet represented the power of God in Judaism? Well, this word-element relationship might be representational of that. Now, the reason why I think this works is because the word of God carries the will of God, and in Genshin, the power of will is very important. It's the primary power of a descender, and the traveler, who is a descender, is prophesied to ascend to the seat of God. Now, this might not mean that they will become the God, but that they will possess a similar power, the power to shape the world of elements with their will, which is the same thing as their word, since God's will is God's word and vice versa. Now, because the elements are supposed to carry the will of a creator, they possess no will of their own. Renee talks about this at length in his investigation notes, especially in regards to azosite, which is a condensed, purified elemental energy that Conrians use as a convenient power source for their ruin machines. And upon closer inspection, the Conrian ruin machines are quite similar in construction to the secret source automatons created by the dragons. They both have special letters engraved on their exteriors and a powerful elemental core that powers them. It's like an exterior programmable language that issues instructions, and the processing power to execute those instructions is on the inside. It's actually quite possible that the Conrians were trying to mimic the means by which dragons controlled the elements with will and words, similarly to how the people of Natlan created phlogiston carving to mimic the ways the dragons controlled the phlogiston with their iridescent inscriptions. However, another way to think about this method of instructing elemental energy with words is that of enforcing order through language. In the very beginning of the Genesis tale from the Hebrew Bible, there was nothing but a vast primordial darkness, a formless, chaotic substance of nothingness. And when God spoke the words, "Let there be light," he didn't necessarily create light, but instead he extracted it from the unified mass. By giving it a name, he gave it a definition, which created boundaries which imposed a separation between this light and everything else. And the more God repeats this process, the more separate and individuated aspects of the primordial chaos become. And in this way, the words of God are the means by which the material world is ordered. Now, this is a very small revelation, but it has very big implications. So basically, words create order from chaos, and it's from chaos that everything that exists was created. Now in alchemy, this chaotic substance is known as the prima materia, and it's generally represented by a cube, often floating in the sky, kind of similar to the cubes in the sky of Simulanka or the ones hovering above Irminsul. Now I think that in Genshin, the prima materia is actually the abyss, and the 7 elements were originally part of this abyss, and that may be why the cube-shaped hypostases are called hypostases. See, in the disciplines of philosophy and religion, a hypostasis is an aspect or a part of a greater whole called a nousia. For example, a letter is a hypostasis of a word, and letters must be put in a specific order for a word to be understood. Now, forbidden knowledge is a truth that cannot be understood, and therefore is likely a substance that simply lacks order, kind of like a bag full of random Scrabble letters. It's just a material that means nothing until it's been placed on the grid of the Scrabble board to form interlocking words. If we look to Simulanka, we can actually see another example of this in Durin, because Durin reverts everything he touches back to its raw material state, which takes the shape of cubes. This seems to be because of his abyssal corruption, which I think is essentially making things forget what shape they're supposed to take, so they revert back to a more primal form, which is the cube. And speaking of Durin, back in version 1.2, we actually had an event with Albedo that focused on a sword called the Festering Desire. This sword was made with the remains of Durin, who in turn had been made of abyssal matter by the witch Rhine-Daughter, which is why the Simulanka version of him had abyssal corruption in the first place. As a result, the sword is full of abyssal power, which is described as a sort of corruption that only the Traveler can withstand due to their ability to purify this corruption, the same way they purified the abyssal corruption from Dvalin's tears. Now, corruption is by definition a sort of decay or unwanted change. For something to be corrupted, there must have been something to corrupt it in the first place, you know? For example, you cannot have a file of corrupted data if there's no original data to corrupt. So if you were to reverse the corruption of something, you would essentially be putting things back in their proper order. It's like trying to unscramble a word. You know the parts for the original word are there in the scrambliness, you just have to rearrange the letters in the correct order in order to reveal it. And until you do that, the letters are gibberish and meaningless. So, purifying the corruption actually means reordering scrambled data, which in the case of the Festering Desire resulted in pure, uncorrupted elemental energy, which means that the Traveler does not have purification power, they have the power to order things. Now, Hoyoverse loves this concept of building order out of chaos, and they use it prolifically throughout their games, usually in the form of a tree of order that grows out of the sea of chaos. Genshin is not free from this structure, as the Chinese terms for Numa and Uxia, which represent the opposing forces of creation in Teyvat, or at least in Fontaine, are tree nature for Numa and chaos nature for Uxia. Therefore, Numa is representing the power of the tree of order, and Uxia is representing the power of the sea of chaos, and you might not have caught it earlier, but I did mention that a hypostasis is an aspect of an Uxia. So if the Uxia is related to the chaos matter, which is related to the abyss, and the hypostasis is an element, then an element is an aspect of the abyss. But the real tree of order in Genshin is Irmin's Soul, which takes raw material in the form of elemental energy and memories into itself via its ley line root system, and then compiles it into a complete, ordered record of the world. And this idea of a tree that establishes order from the infinite nothingness can also be found in Kabbalah, which is a form of Judaic mysticism. Now, this is its tree of life diagram. It's made up of 10 nodes that are called the Sephira that represent the emanations of God, which are then connected by 22 pathways, each represented by a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. If we were to translate this into Genshin terms, the Sephira would be the elements, and the letters are the means by which the elements are ordered. Now, I know there are 10 nodes and only 7 elements, but I'm going to reserve 3 of those nodes for the Abyss, and you'll understand why without me even telling you later on in the video. As a quick disclaimer though, Kabbalah is an incredibly complex and nuanced topic, which we certainly do not have time to go into today, even though it is relevant. So if you do want to know more about how all of this works and how it influenced Genshin, I highly recommend this ongoing series that's written by 2 very passionate theorists I know. It's very thorough, but written in a way that's very easy to understand, and you can find a link to it in the description. But the one thing that I will mention about the Tree of Kabbalah, beyond the stuff that I've already mentioned, is that the diagram of the tree does appear in Genshin during the Narzissenkreuz questline as a part of Renee's world formula, which he was using to try and save the world. And this formula was based on records left behind by Conrian scholars, suggesting that Conria had a very deep understanding of the fundamental principles that underpin the world. And that might be why Conria's king took the name of Irmin. They would have been named after the world tree, or the tree of order, Irmin's Soul. But there's a lot more information to be gleaned from the name Irmin's Soul, because it's a very specific reference to the Nordic world tree Yggdrasil, and believe it or not, this is where it all starts coming together. The Irmin of Irmin's Soul is actually another name for Odin, as is the name Yig. So in both the game and Norse myth, the world tree shares a name with Odin. Now the Drasil means horse, so the name Yggdrasil quite literally translates into Odin's horse, which is a weird name for a tree, I know, but apparently Horse of the Hanged is a kenning or a colloquialism for the gallows, which is where you put people to death via hanging, which means that the real nickname of the tree is Odin's Gallows. Why did they name the tree that? Well, hold that thought. Let's talk a little bit more about this tree first. So the roots of Yggdrasil stem from 3 sacred wells, which may actually be one well, but by 3 different kennings or names. Scholars seem to disagree on this, but it's gonna come up later, so keep it in mind. Now the well, or rather the name of the well, that we are most concerned with is Uderbrunar, which means the Well of Fate. Now this well is home to the 3 Norns, Wyrd, Verdandi, and Skuld, and these 3 ladies are some of, if not the most powerful beings in Norse mythology because they determine the fate of everything. Now, the method by which the Norns dictate fate varies a bit depending on the myth and the source that you're looking at. They're most commonly thought of as weavers of the threads of fate, much like the Greek Moirai. But there are several cases wherein the Norns seem to dictate fate by carving runes into Yggdrasil's trunk, which honestly makes more sense to me because the Norns were the original masters of the secret powers behind the runes. And I think Genshin is recognizing this because Nahida has this very specific line about Farina where she says that Fontaine's prophecy was carved into Irminsul a long time ago. These secret runes, protected and wielded by the Norns, were symbols of ultimate knowledge and also power over the material world, and thus they represented the most primordial and divine source of godly power, kind of like the Hebrew letters in Judaism. For that reason, I've come to think of the Hebrew letters and the runes as examples of root alphabets, since they would have been the first alphabets in the universe, and all alphabets and languages that came afterwards would merely be trying to mimic fragments of their capabilities, and it's very possible that the dragon's letters were exactly this for Teyvat, and that all subsequent lettering systems were derived from it. In addition to this, because letters are symbols, we have to consider the possibility that the symbols of the elements also have more ancient forms. Woba, for example, has a more archaic pyro symbol on his back, and the Geo symbol looks eerily similar to this golden pattern on the doorways of the dragon ruins, albeit the Geo symbol is a little bit more complex. Now, because of the power that the runic letters contained, Odin desperately wanted them for himself. So he hung himself from the branches of Yggdrasil for 9 days, impaled on his own spear and dangling over the Well of Fate, until finally, on the 9th day, the runes revealed themselves to him from the waters below. And that's why the tree is called the Gallows of Odin. He hung himself on it as a form of ritual death. Funnily enough, we see an exact retelling of this myth in the silver twig that we get after completing Sumeru's Archon Quest. And that silver twig is fittingly a branch of Irminsul. You know, given that Irminsul is also a symbol of Sumeru, this myth might actually be why the Sumeru Academia forbids people from investigating the origins of words. Those letters or runes that are found in the Well of Fate are actually forbidden knowledge. Now, because Odin shares a name with King Irmin of Conria, we have to consider the possibility that King Irmin also sought the power of the runes and shared them with the people of Conria just like Odin shared them with the people he governed over, meaning Conrians likely figured out the origin of words and developed a method of using them that's eerily similar to that of the dragons and their iridescent inscriptions. In fact, apart from the Norns and Odin, dwarves are also credited as masters of the runes, and I'm pretty sure Conrians are supposed to be referencing dwarves because they're both A, master craftsmen, B, underground dwellers, and C, several Conrians share names with dwarves from Norse myth, like Elbrick and Daneslif. And we've already kinda talked about how the secret source automatons have a lot in common with the Conrian automatons, right down to their exteriors full of carved letters and elemental power sources. But in addition to this, just as the dragons did, the Conrians seem to engrave their elemental power cores with golden inscriptions, as stated in the description for the power core of the mechanical hypostasis that Conria built. And not only is Conria a nation built underground, it's also built along the roots of Irminsul, the place where the Norns would have been carving fate. And it's also the setting of the book Perrin Harry, which matters because it's apparently got allegorical information on Arlecchino's family history, and Arlecchino is one of the last known survivors of Conria's Crimson Moon dynasty. In Perrin Harry, it is said that those who enter Conria's kingdom from Teyvat must first perform a ritual where they crawl through a chimney tunnel. Once they reach the end, they must declare that they are dead before they are allowed to exit. They are then told, "You have traversed the fire of 2 worlds within the hearth, and here you are reborn." Genshin is particularly consistent about fire representing the process of death and rebirth, and no clearer is this theme illustrated than in Natlan, wherein those who possess an ancient name fall into the Night Kingdom when they die in battle, and they can be resurrected thanks to the combined power of the Ode of Resurrection and the Sacred Flame, which acts as a gateway between 2 worlds, the land of the living and the land of the dead. So they're basically traversing the fire of two worlds within the hearth of the sacred flame. Now you remember those wells of Yggdrasil I mentioned? Well, all three are underground, and one is explicitly located in the realm of the dead. And because the three wells may very well be one well by three names, it's possible that this single well is in the realm of the dead because it's also said that Odin, quote, won the runes, 9 magic songs, and occult wisdom from the realm of the dead. But we also know he got them from a well, and that the knowledge of the runes originally belonged to the Norns, which means that he got them from the Well of Fate, and that this well's location is in the realm of the dead. For video game lore purposes, anyway. I'm not actually going to debate the scholarly side of that logic to anybody, okay? I just want to be clear on that. Pitchforks down. Now, I am very keen on the idea of a singular well, at least in Genshin's case, because in Paranary, the kingdom of Conria is apparently located along the, quote, Sea of Wells, which boasts a Chinese name that means something more like the source of all cosmic waters. And the source of all cosmic waters is basically the same thing as the cosmic primordial chaos from which all things were created, the prima materia, the abyss. Do you see what's happening here? Because if the Sea of Wells is the primordial chaos because it's the sea of all cosmic waters, and the Well of Fate because it's the Sea of Wells, and the primordial chaos of Genshin is the abyss, then the abyss is the Well of Fate as well, and must have a rune equivalent hidden in its depths. And you already know what it is. It's forbidden knowledge, a truth that cannot be understood. You know what else Nahida says can't be understood? Fate, which brings me back to Simulanka, because in that storybook world made of words by witches we're definitely going to come back to in a bit, elemental energy within the ley lines was actually represented by ink, colored ink. And if elemental energy is colored ink and elemental energy was made from the prima materia, which is like forbidden knowledge, then forbidden knowledge is basically black ink. Incidentally, the K that's missing from Simulanka's CMYK color scheme. Now, Anya Andersdottir was a witch who authored Simulanka and also decided its fate, which is why she was its goddess of fate. And she had a bottle of black ink that contained a fantasy truth that she used to write her stories with, hence Simulanka. The other witches would then use their magic to turn that fantasy truth into true fantasy. And I think that they did this through alchemical means because, as we established earlier, alchemy has 2 required parts, blueprints and energy. Well, Anya wrote the blueprints, and I think the other witches added their energy. And among the Hexenzirkel is another witch who just so happens to be a master alchemist who created things in exactly this manner. Both Rheindotter and her student Albedo are considered masters of not just alchemy, but also Conria's unique brand of alchemy, known as Chemia, and both of them happen to paint things into existence. In Shadows Amidst Snowstorms, we saw Albedo use a painting of a chair as a blueprint to transmute its physical form using alchemy, something that he calls an elementary level technique. And in his teaser, we actually see him paint all manner of things like a crystal fly and a geovishap, and all of those things leapt right off the page, which is super funny to me because this year in his birthday letter, he said he wanted to study phlogiston, which is literally used as ink in Natlan, and the Monatu are just phlogiston paintings come to life. And according to the Riftborn Regalia, Rheindotter painted the Rift Wolves on discarded paper and they came to life. And I don't think this is too different from ordering things through words because pictures are worth 1,000 words. They're still capable of conveying will. And what's really funny to me about all of this is that whenever forbidden knowledge is referred to in an indirect form, it's called the blackest black in Chinese, but the first black uses the character for black ink. So in English, it should be like an inky blackness or pitch black. And this is the term that Apep uses to describe the power of darkness that Nibelung tried to retrieve from the abyss, as well as the pitch dark power that transformed the Hilichurls and the dark alien blood that stained the hands of Rex Lapis black. Is this a coincidence or clever wordplay? The world will never know. But it does mean that we can think of the abyss as some kind of inkwell of fate. And now that the picture has started to come together, we can finally answer the first question that I posited at the beginning of this video. How exactly did the Primordial One defeat the dragons? Some of you have already pieced together the answer for yourselves, but I guarantee you that the repercussions of this answer will still surprise you even if you know what it is. Because in the end, everything I've just laid out boils down to one name. But before I explain that, I have to talk about something that has always bothered me about what we've been told about Nibelung. Because on the one hand, Apep says that he wanted to use forbidden knowledge to fight the Primordial One. But on the other hand, Neuvillette says that Nibelung wanted to oppose the Void being another way to refer to the Abyss. But why would he want to both fight the Abyss and try to use its power at the same time? I've heard of fighting fire with fire, but this still seems kind of counterproductive, don't you think? Especially when Nibelung was clearly trying to fight off the Primordial One. Are we trying to say that Nibelung had two targets, the Abyss and the Primordial One? Or were they both the same target? Like, maybe the Primordial One is the Void that Nibelung wanted to oppose. Now I know this sounds really nutty, but hear me out on this. According to Before Sun and Moon, the Primordial One established rulership of Teyvat before going to war with the dragons. And that's kind of strange given that kingship is usually something that's earned. So how could they just declare themselves king before the dragons could even respond? And also have that claim be valid? I think it's because they had control over the Abyss, or at least had some great influence over it. See, during the Caribert quest, Clothar says, "The one who controls the Abyss controls the world." And if he's right, and I think he is, then this would explain why the Traveler's sibling is trying to use the power of the Abyss, and why the 5 sinners took the dark power for themselves, and why Nibelung believed that forbidden knowledge was the key to victory. To control the Abyss is to control the world. Now earlier I likened the Abyss to the Nordic Well of Fate, which would then make Clothar's statement, "The one who controls fate controls the world," and the Primordial One leverages their control over the world using a system of fate. Which means that the Primordial One, much like Odin, likely seized the power of the runes or the words from the Well of Fate, the Abyss, and in turn gained an understanding of how to wield those words to shape the world, to bring order to the chaos, or to reshape what was already there. In this way, the Primordial One is Odin, or in our case, Irmin. Not the Irmin, like the King Irmin, but an Irmin, because I actually think that Irmin is a role in Teyvat, or at least a title that one obtains through a ritual sacrifice, a ritualistic death. And Nibelung might have done something similar. Because we know that Nibelung died and also went to obtain forbidden knowledge, and they were also reborn. But the timing of these events and the way that Apep talks about them has always been really confusing. But they're less confusing if the two acts are the same thing. That is, Nibelung has to die in order to obtain that forbidden knowledge. When we think of it that way, the order of events start to make more sense. Just like Odin hung from the gallows and seized knowledge from the Well of Fate in the realm of the dead, so too must all aspiring Irmins experience a ritual death and rebirth to obtain knowledge and ultimately mastery over the Logos, which makes Nibelung the first recorded Irmin, the first Sky Father, Heavenly Father, which is also another title of Odin. And that also means that King Irmin of Conria may have boasted that name not because it was his real name, but because he was supposed to be the next Sky Father through ritual death and rebirth. And maybe this isn't a foolproof thing. Maybe some people can't handle it, and maybe this King Irmin couldn't handle it because we have a record of him going mad. And this kind of paints Kaya in a very different light, because he also possesses a lot of Odin imagery, like in his singular eye and the treasure hoarder information network that acts as Odin's info-gathering ravens, because the treasure hoarders have a raven insignia and all that. And Kaya was also called Conria's last hope by his father, and he comes from the Albric bloodline. And we know that the Albrics were the regent family, the ruling family for a while after they stepped in for King Irmin when he became indisposed, possibly because his ritualistic death failed. And there are more Irmins to talk about, and we're going to get to them, but this is also where things start to get a little bit messy. Because if we're going by the Norse myths, then this forbidden knowledge of the runes should have been protected by 3 Norn-like beings, right? Well, in our case, those beings are the 3 Moon Sisters, Arya, Sonnet, and Canon. Likening the 3 Moon Sisters to the 3 Fates of either Greek or Norse mythology is a very popular thing for the theory community to do, for a multitude of reasons. But let me throw some new fuel on that fire. Odin was often considered a god of the dead. King Irmin was the king of Conria. Paraneri suggests that Conria is the realm of the dead. And Fischl's story is supposed to be about Conria, with Fischl being being an Odin or Irmin-like figure, both one-eyed with a companion raven, and she was the princess of the Immernachtreich, which roughly translates into Evernight Kingdom. Enkanomiya also experiences the Evernight, and both regions are underground and border the Abyss. And you know what else borders the Abyss and is also underground and associated with the realm of the dead? Natlan's Night Kingdom. Now, when I think of nighttime, I tend to think of the moon, so I think it's a perfectly logical leap to say that the Moon Sisters might have ruled over a worldwide night kingdom where they enacted their role as weavers of the world's fate, at least during the era of dragons. Now, you might not know this, but in Norse mythology, there weren't just 3 Norns. There were countless, and it's said that for every person born, there was a Norn to write their fate. And since Seelies work for the Moon Sisters, and the Moon Sisters are the Norns in this theory, I believe that the Seelies were the lesser Norns. That for every person born into that during the era of dragons, there was a Seelie there to dictate their fate. And for that reason, there's a part of me that believes that the reason why the Traveler isn't subject to the Primordial One's system of fate is because they have their own lesser Norn, a Seelie in the shape of a Paimon. So Paimon unknowingly is dictating the Traveler's fate. That's why she's named Paimon, the demon most loyal to Lucifer, who is represented by the Traveler, Lucifer the Lightbringer. I think she's unconsciously aware of her responsibility towards the Traveler's fate. Now, because they governed over fate, Norns were also master practitioners of prophetic magic, usually taking the form of songs or incantations known as Galders, which they sang to read fate as dictated by the runes. How convenient is it then that every conscious Seelie we've met somehow ends up issuing prophecies? Nabu Malikata, for example, prophesied that Deshret would fail in his attempts to overthrow heaven, but she still gave him forbidden knowledge, which should be the black ink of the abyss, and she passed on a source song to Rukkhadevata, which was then used to create the Aranara. And on top of it all, this woman was named after a Babylonian god of scribes, someone who writes things down. And Sibylla did something similar for Remus, and this makes me really suspicious of Guizhong because she has that starry sea-like vibe of the abyss and is shown writing with black glittery ink, and she also created a bell that composed music. It's possible that she foresaw her own demise, and that's why she left the memory of dust behind for Zhongli, which contained, quote, all of her wisdom, which now that I think about it might make her his lesser Norn. But if you're not a lesser Norn or a Norn and you still wanted to practice the art of prophecy in Norse myth, you were known as a witch. And hello, Hexenzirkel, a coven of witches that seems to be doing really big things behind the scenes. Several of them are considered prophets, no less than 2 are writers, and I can make a damn good case for Nicole to be a Seelie because of this little fairy tale that Wolfie tells about the Seelies, wherein one Seelie became a mute as punishment, and that's why she only speaks in people's heads. Which sounds a heck of a lot like Nicole, doesn't it? And hey, you know, witches usually have familiars, right? And they're often cats, right? Is that why there's this cosmic cat that calls itself the familiar of its sleeping mistress down here in Natlan's Night Kingdom? Actually, this cat's kind of important because this cat says that we have brought so many slumberers to it, and when it says that, it's referring to dead people, which is also what the Wayab are, collectives of dead people who are called the Dreamers because that's what the word Wayab means. And this comparison makes sense because nighttime is for sleeping, and sleeping means dreaming, and death is the eternal sleep. And since the abyss is down there in this dreamland, A's whole line about the waking world you seem, woven from the stuff of dreams, is also fitting because it means that dreams are akin to the abyss, which is akin to the prima materia. And if you talk to the avatar of Irminsul herself, Nahida, in the Imaginarium Theater, she comments on how fortunate we are to be able to use the written word to make a record of our dreams before they disappear, and that maybe that's what fairy tales are. And that brings us back to Anders' daughter being the goddess of fate in the books that she's written, and I think you get the point. But also, did you notice how this scene where the Wall of Darkness chases the Traveler in the Night Kingdom is very similar to the scene from the Golden Slumber questline? And that the Golden Slumber was made by Deshret, who was attempting to seek out forbidden knowledge and learned the process by which to do so thanks to a Seelie? And he experienced at least 1 ritual death, potentially 2 by the time he obtained that knowledge, and he is called the Lord of the Dead. It's literally written on his coffin. It certainly seems like he attempted to walk the path of an Irmin and mimic the powers of the dragons, and he even built word-powered machinery like them. But going back to Natlan and the Night Kingdom for a second, has no one else found it strange the Night Soul pillars down there in the Night Kingdom look a lot like celestial nails. They even perform a similar function as both to suppress and stabilize abyssal matter, which is a very interesting thing, I might add. In previous theories, I've even pitched the idea that these nails are kind of like the spokes of what you'd find on a pin loom, which raises the possible connection between them and the concept of a loom of fate. Not the same one that the Abyss Order is creating, mind you, but the one put in place by Celestia, or whatever its equivalent is. But none of this stuff feels like Descender power to me, or at least not as far as we've seen with the Traveler, and I think this is really important to recognize because the Traveler is one capable of ascending to the seat of God, and they can purify or order the Abyss on their own, no nails required. And yet, the Primordial One seems to mostly be using these powers that I'd associate with the Norns or the Moons. From the use of the Sealies to the Celestial Nails to their desire to forcibly seize the Logos authorities of the Dragons. It's like they have no Logos of their own and rely entirely on borrowed power, which could suggest that 3 of the Primordial One's 4 shades were the Moons, and when they died, much of the Primordial One's powers went with them. Providing they have an ancient name, of course. And this raises the possibility that the Primordial One is a false or incomplete Descender, and without true authority over the Abyss and a lack of Logos, the Abyss is without a master and is likely slowly eroding the world. And we have seen a false, albeit artificial, Descender before in the Narzissenkreuz questline, and I feel like they have a lot more in common with the Primordial One than the Traveler does. This artificial or false Descender was Renee after he'd gone through a ritual death and been reborn as Narzissenkreuz. Now, Renee is a very fascinating case study here because his tulpa form was definitely abyssal in nature, but he knew that he required the Sword of Reason, or Logos, to create the new world that he dreamed of. This sword obviously represents the power of Logos, it's named after it, but it also contains the power of the will and the word and order. But as Narzissenkreuz, he was unable to wield the power of Logos, which meant that he couldn't be the catalyst that helped to birth a new world. As he says, all will die in a shell, a husk of a dream. Before Sun and Moon also alludes to an eggshell, referencing the mythological trope of the world egg, from which everything hatched, but it also says that unless the shell is broken, the world cannot be reborn. Similarly to what Narzissenkreuz says, and similar to the description for the newborn fire sprite, which comments on how the baby dragon refuses to leave the safety of its egg. It refuses to wake from its dream. And if it doesn't wake from its dream, then there is no Logos. Incidentally, the chapter where we meet Narzissenkreuz is called Waking from the Great Dream. And that's the chapter where we prove that they can't actually be a Descender or do the Logos thing. So to me, this makes the Primordial One an Irmin who did not achieve enlightenment. They still went through the process of ritual death and traveling to the realm of the dead to retrieve forbidden knowledge, but I suspect that they took this power by force, instead of earning it through study and reflection. So their rebirth was incomplete. They're still inside their eggshell, which means that they don't have the power of Logos, only abyssal power. And this incomplete rebirth process might be the reason why some people suspect the Primordial One of being an alien life form that came from outside of Teyvat. Because there are only 2 things in-game right now that are considered alien: Descenders like the twins, or abyssal creatures, who are said to have dark alien blood, the only substance capable of staining the golden hands of Rex Lapis black. That last line is more important than you'd think because Rex Lapis, or as we know him, Zhongli, also has the role of Irmin. And no matter who or what you think Zhongli is, a Dragon King, a God King, a Descender, or whatever, everyone can at least agree that Zhongli is emulating a ton of Dragon Civilization's aspects. Most obviously, we have his Exuvia, which takes the shape of a 4-clawed dragon. Claws are actually relevant here because dragons representing the Emperor, or like the Supreme King, so like a Nibelung, would have had 5 claws. Dragons with 4 claws would have a lower rank, at least in Chinese mythology. And by the by, an Exuvia is a cast-off insect shell, a shell that gets shed. It kind of reminds me of the shell of the egg that the Primordial One was born from. So perhaps the Exuvia and the Primordial One's egg have similar natures because they would represent what gets cast aside during rebirth. But less obvious is the fact that in his statue of 7, Zhongli sits atop a throne that is engraved with unknown letters. But many of these letters are quite reminiscent of the blocky Hebrew lettering that the Abrahamic God is said to have used to create the world. Fitting since this guy called for order so often, and God created order from chaos. And maybe that's why the abyssal corrupted Durin shoots out these blocks that look just like Zhongli's meteor. And as the prime of the Adepti, he also taught the magic of sigils. These are magic words written on paper, the most notorious of which is the sigil of permission, which allows the wielder access to divine power, which is golden, much like the color of all elements combined, or the color of a descender's will. And actually, the mist-veiled lead elixir suggests that sigils and control over the elements are two of his four primary powers, the third being the union of these two things in the form of alchemy, and the fourth is subspace creation, where he can create small, self-contained words using a combination of the previous three techniques. In a way, this is a lesser form of the Logos creation method. And to top it all off, his pillars also have this symbol that has, in recent years at least through unknown means, come to represent Odin's spear Gugnir. And my buddy Crystal Marie, who basically has a PhD in all things Zhongli at this point, noticed that his signature weapon has this bit of indecipherable writing at the tip, which she believes is a reference to Gugnir, because in the Ring Cycle opera, that spear was said to be engraved with the contracts that granted Odin his powers, and Genshin loves its Ring Cycle references just about as much as dragons love contracts. Zhongli is the god of contracts, Neuvillette is the enforcer of contracts, and then there's silly little Ahau who entered a contract with Kinich. And Odin had to pierce himself with his own spear and then hang from the gallows to seize the knowledge of the runes from the depths of the Well of Fate in the underworld, and Zhongli, for some reason, decided to become a funeral director after faking his own death. And perhaps the fact that he is an Irmin is why Ajdaha suggests that Zhongli will reach the end of time. Words that echo those of a sinner, Vedderfilnir, who spoke them to the traveler's sibling back in the Caribert quest. But the last thing I want to mention about him is the fact that he's holding a cube and is the only Archon to do so. Earlier, we talked about the Prima Materia and how it was represented by floating cubes in alchemical diagrams at times, and also how this imagery was referenced by the cubes floating above Irminsul. The thing is, these cubes belong to the sustainer of heavenly principles, and on their surface is this unique eye-shaped symbol. In previous theories, I've pointed out that this symbol is related to Irminsul, and I think that this is because Irminsul has a symbiotic relationship with the Prima Materia, and this symbol represents the sea the Prima Materia comes from, just like it does in Hoyo's other games. And that might be why we see it on Ororon, an important figure from Natlan's Nightwind tribe, which is the tribe closest to the Night Kingdom. It's also a symbol found on the Wyob's wings as well, indicating that they could be related to the Lesser Norns, just like the Night Kingdom Sleeping Mistress. And curiously, the symbol is also found on the wings of the twins, which could allude to their relationship with Teyvat and the balance of order and chaos. And fittingly, it's these boxes marked with the Eye of the Abyss that take away the traveler's Sword of Logos at the very beginning of the game, sealing away many of their powers and tampering with their memories in the process. And now, a little Norn named Paimon has to guide the traveler through a journey to reclaim those powers and their memories. And if this eye symbol represents the knowledge of the Abyss, that power that's held within words that were formed from the letters that are found in the depths of the Well of Fate in the land of the dead that belong to the moons but can be seized and wielded by others, then what do you think the real irrigation of mankind was? Hey, welcome to the end of the video, the place where I put all the stuff I couldn't fit into the actual video. Although this video was pretty long and I don't really want to add too much to it, but I do have a couple more little things to say about the concept of Irmin as a role instead of as a name of a singular person. So under the logic presented in this theory, anyone who attempts to learn the origin of words through means of sacrificial death can have the title of Irmin. For example, Nibelung, the Primordial One, Deshret, and potentially King Irmin, Horoptatyr, and Zhongli, among others, all seem to have the Irmin role, and thus have the potential to seize the authority of Teyvat eventually. But the most interesting one is the one that I didn't really talk about all that much, and that's the Traveler, because they also might end up being an Irmin. That might be the point of this whole journey. As someone who can ascend to the seat of God, it's very possible that the journey itself is the one that ends in a sacrificial death to obtain secret knowledge, something the Abyss Twin may have already done, which is why they're not in Irminsul. The Golden Slumber questline also kind of alludes to this being the case, as it kind of mirrors the Traveler's journey. We basically have to activate 7 terminals and then ascend to the throne, all with the assistance of a tiny floating companion. Yes, it's really high level, but I still think it's worth noting, especially because of that one scene in the Night Kingdom where it looks like the Golden Slumber is trying to swallow us. I also think it's really interesting that Hoyo seems to want to mix this concept of logos and word power with technological advancement, because it makes me think that words in this case mostly refer to programming languages, which, if true, would explain a lot of the digital visual metaphors. But yeah, I think that's all from me for today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, week, month, year, or however long it'll be before we meet meet again. A special thanks to my channel members for their unwavering support and patience. You guys rock. Another thanks to Red Magic for making this video possible through the power of sponsorship, and thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time.